Welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes. I'm delighted today for this special to be joined by Alan Morrison. You will recognise Alan. Alan, you've been contributing for some time on A Celtic State of Mind. And since then, obviously, you have been contributing elsewhere. Today's discussion is very much focused on SFA refereeing under the spotlight. And I think it's a good time to do this, Alan. There's a lot happening at the moment within Scottish football that I think we need to have this discussion. Take us up to date. Where are we just now? What's happening in the background? Moves and obviously Brendan Rodgers being pulled in front of the Beaks, etc. Why is it a good time now to discuss this?
Yeah, no. So thanks very much for having me on, Paul, for starters. And yes, I'm an occasional substitute, the sort of Paddy McCourt of Acsom in that sense. That makes me sound far more interesting than what I really am, by the way.
You're
But
the cult hero, the hero of the
yeah,
Acsom team. Absolutely, yes.
one letter difference, and I think you're there. But so yeah, listen, there's a lot going on in refereeing world. I mean, as we are talking, I know we're recording this; it'll go out at a later time. Brendan Rodgers and Celtic are in positive adult discussion, I'm sure, with the SFA over events at Tynecastle and John Beaton and Don Robertson's performances there. So, but even last week we saw Crawford Allen, the head of refereeing operations at the Scottish Football Association, who have complete end-to-end authority over referees. He announced that he would be resigning at the end of the season in a surprise move. So, and all of these things come hot on the heels of we a remarkable 75 league game run that the Rangers had without conceding a penalty, which it was so remarkable that even the mainstream media was actually touching the topic, which is very rare around these subjects. John Beaton himself, that I mentioned, was quoted as saying that 75 match league run was an anomaly that can't be explained. Graeme Spears, on a podcast that I'll come to, found that the whole thing bizarre. Richard Gordon wrote in the Press and Journal that he asked, how can it be explained? So that question, I think, is a great question, and that's partly why we're here today, to try and shine a light really on some of the trends and patterns around Scottish Football Association referees and their performances in the SPFL Premiership. That run of penalties, actually, what people sometimes forget is it came hot on the heels, as they say, again, of another run of 44 matches that the Rangers had without conceding a league penalty. And just by coincidence, that first run started almost exactly to the day that Crawford Allen was appointed head of refereeing operations. It's a coincidence, I'm sure. So listen, really trying to answer Richard Gordon's question is, how can this be explained? Um, and I suppose the penalty run was the sort of stepping on point in terms of looking at this question of refereeing and are there patterns and are there trends in the data for me. I had been interested in it, and we'll talk about the Yorkshire Whistler project a bit later. But to me, it didn't necessarily. It was just like one data point in itself. Counting penalties, is that really kind of that meaningful? So I looked at a number of data points, and we'll go through these in time as we go through the discussion. The reason I'm starting with that is to sort of say, to try and help address Richard Gordon's question. I put together all of this information into I'll call it a report, if you like. Might sound a bit grand, but there you go. And various members of the media were offered the opportunity to publish this, because I don't want to be rude, Paul, but I didn't actually want to be here. I'm not saying that because I don't want to spend time with you. I do and do regularly. It's the fact that I would rather that this data and information was presented in the public domain, rather than on a Celtic podcast. But here we are, and the reason for that was that I was informed by a very well respected, well known journalist that covers Scottish football comprehensively, that the information that I had, it would be impossible to print in Scotland because of commercial considerations. Now think about that. What I didn't get, right, was, oh, it's partisan, or it's unfair, or it's unbalanced, or it's inaccurate, or all that It's not that. It's clearly in the public interest, but no commercial considerations. Various media partners in Scotland don't want to upset other stakeholders in Scotland, and therefore this information has to be put out there through a Celtic podcast. And I'm glad it's Acsom, and I'm glad it's here. But that's not how I wanted to do it. But interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that tells a hugely important part of the story in itself, Alan. The fact that commercial considerations is something I think that the mainstream in Scotland have probably used to not hide as such behind, but I think they're using that as a reason for not upsetting a certain cross-section of their readership, viewership of society, of Scottish football. And I think it works two ways, because you're right, the mainstream media, you start asking yourself now, what do they have in terms of advantages over an alternative media, an independent media, fan media? There's various different titles for it now, monikers, but we all know what it is. We've got the established media within Scotland that not that long ago were selling, up to 1 million papers, some of them a day, newspapers, and the influence they had was incredible, Alan. I mean, they could definitely decide on what a narrative was. They could easily infiltrate and influence the thought processes and the state of mind of a nation, never mind a football fan base. And here we have confirmation that even though they are coming away with certain suggestions that it cannot be explained, they are unable, and it will be decisions above, obviously, their pay grade. They are unable sometimes to cover stories that they think are definitely within the public interest. And what we mean by that as well, Alan, if you invest in something, then you financially, emotionally, I think, deserve someone to journalistically cover all bases. And that's not what we're getting at the moment. If a commercial consideration is holding their decision back. Also, with regards to the football clubs themselves, and let's include all the football clubs in this. If a decision is made, and it's because of what we're about to discuss here, the reasons around that cannot be ignored. And it's on the last day of the season, and I've used this as an example. It's on the last day of the season, and it results in a football club being relegated. And it's a goal difference, it's a point, whatever it may be. And because of the culture within our football establishment, it results in a football team being relegated. It affects everybody involved in that football club, not just the emotional and the financial investment of the football fans, but the livelihoods of everybody who loses their job as a result of it. So it is in the public interests on a couple of different levels. What I would say is, it is great to have you, Alan. I know that I'm the backup, but it is great to have you here. But it just shows you as well that eventually, and it's not quite there yet, but I think eventually what will happen is there will just be media. There will just be media, and it'll be good and bad. And what you'll have in terms of that, what I mean by that is standard and quality, good and bad quality. It will start leveling out, and it'll all be about the quality of the research, the opinion, the entertainment, all of the above. We're not quite there yet, and there is still this separation, if you like, between mainstream media and the fan alternative media landscape, which obviously I'm in and Acsom is part of. But it's interesting that you say, when it comes to a discussion point like this, that quite frankly, the mainstream won't touch. We have got the freedom to be able to say, well, we are going to cover this. And we're going to cover it in such a way, Alan, that this is not rehearsed, it's not versed, and it's not scripted. If there's something in there that I doubt or I disagree with, or even if I think someone within the Acsom audience might question, I'm going to throw that at you. You're able to come back with the facts, with the numbers, with the data. And I think that by the end of it, some of the information that we're going to share today, Alan, will ensure that the story is out there, and the football fans and those that are invested in this game, and there's a great many of them, the Scottish football fan base is huge, will look at this and think, right, okay, this is a Celtic platform, but they're not just talking about Celtic. We're not just talking about how this affects Celtic. We're talking about how the SFA has a culture, and how that culture has to change. And some of these issues that you're talking about that are happening right now, the resignation of Crawford Allen, the punishment or otherwise of Brendan Rodgers, we don't know how that's going to go yet. We're recording this before the hearings findings have been released. I think it's a great time to put it out there, and we welcome as many people within the Acsom community to comment on it. But also, I know that journalists do tune into the show as well, Alan, and it's something that might push them towards covering the story in more detail. I would hope that it does.
And I think and that all makes sense. And I think, to be fair as well to people in the media, it was in December that Graeme Spears, that I know a lot of people know, well-known journalist in Scottish football, who's now got his own independent podcast, did invite me onto his podcast to discuss this topic now. And so credit to him for actually opening up the discussion. But he obviously sits outside the mainstream really now. He's got his own independent operation as far as his podcast go. But he did have Matthew Lindsay of the Herald on, who it would be safe to say is we could call a mainstay of Scottish football journalism, and probably exhibits all of the traditional behaviours that we associate with mainstream Scottish football journalists as well. I mean, Matthew, when I presented some of the data, basically he seemed confused. I couldn't see him because we weren't on visual, but he did profess to needing a lie down after the show. In fact, I very much got the impression that as I was going through the data, he was sitting there with his fingers in his ears, going la 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 la. I don't want to hear this. I might be being very unfair to him. I'm sure he could grasp the material presented, although there was no evidence that was the case. Anyway, so listen, I will put a link into that podcast, I'm sure, as well. But listen, as you said, this is a really important topic, and it is about, if I can be serious for a moment, it's about holding the Scottish Football Association to account. That's what journalism should do. Journalism's there to hold power to account. This isn't actually about Celtic. It isn't even about Rangers. It's about the Scottish Football Association. Because what people might not realise is that we take it for granted that you turn up to a game on a Saturday or whatever, and there's a referee and lines people and all that sort of thing. But the sole responsibility end to end for the provision of refereeing services is all kind of hermetically sealed within the sort of the SFA. So I'm talking about recruitment, training, development, assignment, monitoring, assessing, promotion, demotion. All of it sits within the culture and the organisation of the SFA, and it means that the head of refereeing operations, and that's Crawford Allen currently, has an enormous, has enormous influence really over the end-to-end provision of that service. There's very little what we would call in business separation of duty, separation of responsibility, very little independent oversight of what goes on. And we'll come to some of those kind of what could we do better things maybe at the end. But what I'm really looking to do in this session is really to establish, does Scottish football have a problem with its refereeing? I believe that it does, and that should be a case of concern for supporters of all clubs, not just Celtic supporters of all clubs.
Yeah.
So as we go through the data then, what really we should expect to see in general, if you just think about the context of Scottish football for a second, is that you've got two largely dominant clubs. I mean, that's self-evident. Neither one of the Rangers or Celtic, neither team outside of those three have won the league for about 40 years, right? So, and if you look at most of the league tables over that period, it's generally 1 and 2 relatively close, and then third place team is often many, many points behind. Therefore, when it comes to looking at patterns in the data over multiple years, not 10 games, not even one season, but looking at patterns of data over multiple seasons, I would expect that the profile of decisions, either for and against Celtic and Rangers, would be broadly similar. There'll be some spikes, there'll be some short-term peaks and troughs, but over a longer period, I'd expect that to be pretty similar. So let's go back to the penalty run then. So Crawford Allen is appointed on the 13th of January, 2020. Rangers go 44 matches from the 30th of December 2019 to the 20th of April 21 without conceding a penalty. They then, I think, concede between April 21 and January the 18th, 2022. I think they concede something like 4. but then they go 75 matches, nearly 2 years without conceding a league penalty, up to January the 2nd, 2024. I mean, these are remarkable runs, you would think, right? And what is more remarkable, again, is we try and place this into context. So that second run of 75 matches was at a time when 9 months into that 2 years, Scottish football adopted video assistant referees, VAR. So VAR was adopted at that time, and what does that mean? And I have to apologise to everyone if I'm. Can you see my screen? I've not used this before, so apologies. Thank you. So listen, this is very simple. This is really showing the average number of penalties awarded in the Premiership every week. So 2021-22, no VAR. There was an average of 1.68 penalties per game week over the 38 weeks. And then in 22-23, it jumped to an average of 2.42. This season, it's gone down a little bit to 2.16, but that represents a 44% increase in penalties awarded in the Premiership in the period largely covering this 75 match run. So what does that mean? It means that all the teams are getting more penalties, but there's one team that doesn't seem to be suffering from that. So that's kind of noteworthy, I would say. But listen, counting penalties, as I say, is a bit limited. It doesn't really give you context. And actually, there's some good work done on Twitter, and I need to thank a couple of people here. Let me just make that a wee bit bigger. So this graphic here is European consecutive runs without conceding a penalty. Now, hands up, we're all reliant on data sources. I think Transfer Market were used for this analysis, but it wasn't analysis I did. This was something that a brilliant account called Scotland's Coefficient did. And then you'll see some red numbers on the screen as well. That was a Twitter account or X account called Lint. So let me just explain that then. So this kind of backs up kind of what my concern was when we started counting penalties, which is that although Rangers' run is remarkable, it isn't unique. That in fact, Rangers are really only in a UEFA Cup place when it comes to games without conceding a penalty. When you look back to this century over some of the runs, Racing Club Lens apparently in 2006, around 2006 season, went 103 games without conceding a penalty. And we see, PSV Eindhoven 90, Manchester United 85. We all remember the Alex Ferguson days, and then Barcelona quite recently 78. But again, context. So a couple of things. I'll bring you now to the red numbers, and you'll see that Celtic appear on this list down below, near the bottom of in the relegation zone, really, in that they had a run of 50 matches without conceding a penalty around about the 2007 season. But look at the red number 4. That's the number of penalties Celtic received during that run. So they went 50 games without conceding a penalty. They only got 4 penalties in that time. The same with Lens. Lens went 103 games without conceding a penalty, but they only got 7 penalties in that time. And so that's important context. It's the differential. There's only one team in that list that is close to Rangers for the number of penalties, 24, that they received at the same time as not being penalised in their own penalty area, and that's Barcelona in 2018. Now, that Barcelona run in 2018 is currently the subject of a formal investigation for referee bribery. And it's the only run in Europe that comes close in terms of the difference in differential between penalties won and penalties conceded. So again, we're starting to add in a bit more context that brings life to this a little bit more. Last season, there wasn't a single club in the top 20 leagues in Europe, as UEFA would judge it by their coefficients. There wasn't a single club in any of those top 20 leagues that didn't have a penalty awarded against them, apart from Rangers. And if you look at the actual differential within the context of Scotland, it's almost even more staggering. So again, this isn't my data, so I want to thank an X account called JB Loves Celtic. He put together this table which shows from 18-19 to 23-24 the total number of penalties awarded and conceded in Scotland only. And really what I want to, I know there's a lot of numbers on here, but just focus on the last column. That's the difference, the margin between the penalties awarded and the penalties conceded. So in that period, the Rangers got 46 more penalties awarded to them than they conceded. Celtic are only on 21. Well, Celtic won 5 out of 6 titles in this period, so it wasn't as if this is the second best team.
Yeah.
If you look back to the list I showed you before, your Barcelonas, your Manchester Uniteds, and your PSVs, these runs were all happening when those sides were dominating in their leagues. That isn't the case here. So that context is really very important. And for a lot of these, what I did with a lot of these analyses is, as well as just presenting the numbers, I applied a very simple statistical concept called a Z score. I don't want to bore or confuse people too much, but essentially the Z score tells you how many standard deviations away the number, your number, in this case 46, is from the population of numbers in the table. Most 95% of the data should appear within 2 standard deviations, and 99% should appear within 3 standard deviations. Clearly, there's something odd happening if your data is without that. And Rangers' 46 penalties is easily, it's actually 8 standard deviations from the mean. It's just an outrageous outlier in that respect. So listen, but that kind of, I think that flags that there's possibly an issue here. But again, in my mind as an analyst, my questions are more around, yeah, but how many penalties should they have conceded? How many penalties should they have got? And also, what about other big calls like red cards? Because penalties are not the only big calls that have a big influence on football matches. And what's the impact of these decisions? I mean, I could get 30 penalties as a team, but if every single one of them was in the 90th minute when I'm 5-0 up, it's virtually meaningless in terms of the impact on the game. So we need to look at that as well. So if I move on a little bit, then I want to introduce really the sort of the Yorkshire Whistler. This is really trying to address the question of were the penalty awards correct or not. It's a very fundamental question, and there was no way you were going to find anybody within Scotland that isn't loaded or tainted in some way with either severe hatred of one side of Celtic or Rangers, or support for this team or that team within the Scottish context. It's very difficult to find someone who's truly kind of neutral and objective. Now, one of the benefits I have is that I live in England, so I'm kind of an outsider as far as the Scottish football bubble is concerned. Live in South Yorkshire and Sheffield. So I, through my network of people that I know through the local football scene, I was put in contact with a professional referee who very kindly agreed to act as an arbiter of decisions in Scottish football. He is FA trained. He's a professional referee, active. Has got previously, I think he said he might have watched the occasional Old Firm derby on the telly if it was on, but other than that, no interest in Scottish football. He's a Sheffield Wednesday season ticket holder. I've never met him. We communicate by email. And what he has agreed to do is, if I send him the big calls from the games involving the big two, and the reason that it's the big two is because, as I've said before, we could do Hearts, Aberdeen, etc. But A, I've got to be careful about the amount of time that he spends on this and what have you, and B, it's kind of, if you look at the gaps between the second and third, it's kind of immaterial in the grand scheme of things. I would love it if there was a third and a fourth team to throw into the mix. That would be brilliant. So it's really looking at the big calls. Now, what is a big call? Okay, that's a subjective thing. It's kind of like you know one when you see one. If there's a dodgy penalty or a goal allowed that should have been disallowed, or vice versa, or a red card given, or maybe should have been given, you can guarantee that it's probably going to be on the BBC highlights, probably going to be on the SPFL highlights. It's definitely going to be flagged up on social media, right? You know for sure. So really, if you look at all those sources, I can then get a sense of what are the talking points, what are the big calls in those games, and then I package those up with some video highlights, and then he basically goes through them, gives me his opinion, whether he thinks they're right, wrong, or what have you. And then what I do is say, well, if it's a wrong decision, what is the potential impact of that call? And this is where we get into a couple of concepts we just need to spend a little bit of time with. So again, I come back to this question of, if for example you're 4-0 up and you get a penalty in the 90th minute and it's the wrong decision, right? It's a bad call, for whatever reason. What is the impact of that? Well, if it's the 90th minute and you're 4-0 up, the impact in terms of expected points is almost zero. It's going to have no impact on the final score. If it's 0-0 and you get a dodgy penalty in the 90th minute, the impact is enormous. You're probably
Yeah.
then looking at a team at that moment that it's 0-0 in the 90th minute, the home team's probably on 1.1 expected points, and the away team's probably on 0.9 to allow for some home advantage. If you score a goal in the 90th minute to make it 1-0, you've probably added about 1.6 expected points. You probably jump up as the home team to about 2.7 expected points, because you've still got a few moments left. The other team could equalize in those last bits of added time, etc. So you never quite get to 3, if you know what I mean, right? So 1.6 is probably the highest jump you can take in terms of expected points impact of a big decision. So I can then work that out based on if it's goals. It's quite a simple calculation that a site called the American Soccer Analysis, which is a brilliant site, they produced a model that showed that based on the time of the game and the score at that time, what is the expected point impact of the goal at every given moment in the game. So I use that model. And then for sendings off, I looked back at all of the sendings off over the last few years in the SPFL, and I worked out what was the impact on the game in terms of, after the sending off, the score before the sending off was this. After sending off, the other team conceded 2 goals or 1 goal or no goals, and then average it all out over time, and then built a model that sort of said, really, it doesn't really matter when in the first. If you get players sent off, it doesn't really matter when in the first half it happens. It doesn't change your expected points, but it
Right.
starts to decrease the closer you get to 90 minutes. The impact becomes less, obviously, because you're playing less time with only 10 players. So it's about 0.51 expected points that you would lose up to about the 50th minute, and then after that, it kind of slopes off towards the 90th minute. So again, you can apply that model to the impact of that. So what have we found with the Yorkshire Whistler then? So let me just come back to the graphics here. Sorry, I'm a bit slow. So first of all, what I'm showing you here is, and it's very small, and I'll make it bigger. These are the penalties that the Yorkshire Whistler reckons that should have been awarded against Rangers in the time that he's been doing his analysis. Now, the first 2 appear. Actually, one of them was on the day, the last game that happened. The Aberdeen game was the last penalty before the 75 match run, and the Ross County one was slightly earlier on in that season. And then there was 4 penalties that he thought should have been awarded against Rangers during that 75 match run. Now, we'll talk. Probably end up talking a little bit about unconscious bias as we go through the show. If I was being honest, I've never said this to Yorkshire Whistler, and I hope he doesn't watch this. If I were to, having studied his work for the last 2.5 years, if I was to sort of offer my opinion on what's the Yorkshire Whistler's unconscious bias, I think quite naturally, because he's a human being, he has a tendency to support the referee's decision and needs a bloody good reason to go against it, right? So
Yeah.
his default position will be, you really need to convince me if I'm going to go against this decision, and that manifests itself in some interesting ways. So, for example, the Yang sending off against Hearts, his opinion was that was a red card, and he would have given a red card. But he also said to me that having the referee having given a foul and given Yang the yellow card, because these are largely subjective calls, he said that wasn't an unreasonable call to make, and therefore that also he wouldn't have stood behind it. He personally would have given a red card, but he can understand why the referee gave a yellow because of all the mitigating factors. And therefore the actual, what he couldn't understand was why John Beaton was essentially re-refereeing the game when Robertson had come up with a plausible explanation. So he gave, but his decision was to say yes, it was the correct decision to give Yang the red card. So there's a bit of nuance there. And as I say, the reason I mention what I think is his unconscious bias is because I think what that serves to do is probably deflate the numbers slightly in terms of number of wrong calls, in the sense that you could argue, because so many of these calls are subjective, you could argue either on process or actual interpretation that some of these, more of these were probably wrong. But having said that, the first season that he did this, he found over 30% of the calls to be wrong. I think that's an astonishing number. If you recall, a few months ago, the SFA marked their own homework and came out with this report that said that 99.97% of all calls, or something ridiculous number, were correct. Well, hooray, we've marked our own homework. He has a slight, and he's a very supportive of the referees. He had a much different view. Now, that error rate has fallen to 20% this season, which is still high, but it's a lot lower than it was. So, what has been the overall impact of the calls that he's deemed to be correct, incorrect? And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to find. I think we've found the missing graph. Oh, here we go. It's the last one. Apologies for that. My fault. I've not got them in the right order. So, sorry, editing alert. So this is the summary of the impact of expected points that the Yorkshire Whistler has identified based on the wrong calls that he's identified in games affecting the top two over the last 2 3/4 seasons. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that Rangers have benefited to the tune of about it's probably about 6 or 7 points. Sorry, about 4 or 5 points, probably more. And this is an estimate, more than what you'd have expected them to have over that period. Whereas Celtic have probably got about around 7 points. So the net total is about a swing of just over 11 expected points over the 2 3/4 seasons that Rangers have had to their advantage or to Celtic's detriment due to bad calls by referees, as adjudicated by an independent, neutral expert. Now, if you think about it in terms of the 2 years ago, the title was won by 4 points. Last season, it was won by 7 points. This season, it's neck and neck. So over 11 points. Again, it's an estimate. Doesn't sound a lot, but it's actually significant. It's a significant number in the context of a very tight title race. So that's the kind of Yorkshire Whistler project, which is still running, really. But again, I come back to the question: well, how many penalties should they have had in terms of not just from the point of view of which was the right call, which was not the right call. If you actually look at the pattern of play, the extent to which teams attack or don't attack, defend, etc., how many penalties is it possible to evaluate how many penalties teams should get? And very helpfully, I found an article in the European Journal of Sports Science, which is quite a nice publication, actually, which publishes I would call them sort of academic standard articles on sport and sports science. And the article that they provided is that really the entries into the box is a pretty good proxy for things like how many penalties you should be getting. If you think about it logically, the only way you can get a penalty is if you get the ball in the box, right? You can't get a penalty if you don't get the ball in the box. It's really as simple as that. So basically, what I did is I looked at how often do teams need to get into the box to be awarded a penalty on average, and vice versa. How many times does the opponent need to get into your box before they'll be awarded a penalty? And I would expect that both for Celtic and Rangers, it will be roughly the same. I'd actually expect them, because they're so dominant and because they attack more, there'll be a kind of, I expected an effect whereby they would have a slightly lower average than the rest of the teams, meaning that when teams play Celtic and Rangers, they're generally set up to defend. The mindset is to defend. The defensive organisation is usually quite strong. Everybody's focused on defending, and so they probably make less defensive errors. Whereas when the ball occasionally goes into the Celtic or the Rangers box, because it's kind of unexpected, you might expect a proportionally, by an average, slightly more penalties. That's kind of what I would have expected. So what did we actually find? So this is the first picture. Shows you the number of times an opponent in the SPFL has to get into your box on average before they get awarded a penalty. Now, the average in the SPFL is 147. So on average, every 147 entries into the opponent's box, you'll get a penalty. It's an average. It obviously doesn't mean that every 147 penalties. It's an average over 3 years of data. Celtic, they're right in the middle. They get a penalty on average about 142 times, so slightly below the average. That doesn't surprise me. But the absolute outlier, statistically, again, hugely and highly statistically significant, is that you need to get into the Rangers box 372 times on average before you get awarded a penalty. I mean, it's just a staggering outlier.
But I mean,
So
looking at
let's
this table,
yeah.
Alan, sorry to butt in, because it is, like you say, so obvious when you see it, mapped out like this. Looking at this table, I'm going to throw this question in because of where we are in relation to Celtic being in a hearing with the SFA in relation to Brendan Rodgers' comments, and how it's a bigger issue than that. Do you believe that the club, obviously having employed a KC to plead the case, are armed with a dossier of data and information that you cannot argue with? Do you think the club are using this as and I know we've joked about it all week. We've had the picture of Dermot Desmond with his flamethrower going into the meeting, all that kind of stuff. Do you think the club have finally got to the point where they realise that with the data, it makes the argument so much stronger that there is an issue with regards to this? Because, I mean, everything that you've presented so far has been so insightful, but when you look at that table in particular, Alan, 372 visits into that Rangers box before you get a penalty. That's fine if that's an average. That is miles off being an average. 100.
Yeah,
Did you see the 100?
and it's
147?
Yeah, it's over nearly 100 games. It's over like nearly three complete seasons as well. So to answer your question, I believe that Celtic are increasingly data driven, and are increasingly using the available data because let me be clear, all the data that I'm presenting here, I've either taken from Transfer Market, from FOTMob, which is free. Anyone can access it. From my own site, which is free. You don't have to subscribe to it to access the data there. From the BBC site, again, BBC Sports site, which is free. So everything that I'm presenting here, all the data, you don't have to have a fancy subscription to StatsBomb or a £500 a year Scout account to get all this data. It's all public domain. So, and I think Celtic are waking up to the fact that there is significant data out there that, with a bit of time and effort and pulling it together, can actually start to reveal some of the trends that I'm going through today. So let me give you the other part of this equation, which is how many times do you need to get into the opposition box before your team gets a penalty? So again, the average is 147. Actually, the Rangers are bang on the average, which again, that seems reasonable to me. 147 times on average they get a penalty when they get into the opposition box. But the outlier, and again, it falls outside, sorry, the sort of Z score, making it meaning it's highly statistically significant. And I hope I don't have to say that too often, but I do. Highly statistically significant is Celtic. Celtic have to get into the opposition box 203 times before they get a penalty in the SPFL, which again is clearly the outlier in this analysis. And again, it's kind of statistically significant. So that's kind of like the likelihood of getting a penalty. What I now want to go on to is really the impact, because again, what's the hypothesis? What would I expect? I would expect that, and we've talked about this earlier, that over the course of multi-years worth of data, that both Celtic and Rangers, sometimes they'll get a last-minute winner penalty, sometimes they'll get a penalty when they're 6-0 ahead or 5-0 ahead or whatever. It'll broadly there'll be a few spikes, there'll be a few outliers, but as a trend, as a pattern, over multiple years, it will be much of a muchness. Yeah, that's kind of what I would expect. So let's have a look at that. And what we find then is this is simply the expected points differential then between penalties that have been awarded and penalties that have been conceded. And again, there is one significant outlier here. If you look at the time that the Rangers got their penalty, i.e. the match time, the minutes into the game, and you look at the score at that time, then they've basically benefited by about just over 15 points in terms of what those penalties have done to the final, is likely estimated to have done to the final score. With Celtic, that's 3 times bigger than Celtic. I mean, again, in this period, Celtic have won the league twice, but 3 times. And if you look at it, Hearts are third, so you can see there's a little bit of. And if you look at the bottom there, Ross County, Motherwell, Livingston, Kilmarnock, there's a little bit of the better teams at the top, the worst teams at the bottom, kind of thing. But again, there is one statistically significant outlier, and that is again the Rangers in terms of the timing of when penalties get awarded and the estimated impact that has on the points that they win. Why should that be? Why should there be a difference on that? That doesn't really make any sense to me. But if we break this down a little bit, this is the average time in the match whereby Celtic and Rangers both receive a penalty, which is the green column, and then concede a penalty. So let me just break this down for you. So the red column, the greens column, sorry, is the average time to get a penalty. Celtic, on average, when they get a penalty, it's around about the 59th minute. Okay? When the Rangers get a penalty, it's about the 47th minute. So it's like 11 minutes earlier in the game. Why does that matter? I'll come to that in a second. And if we look at, when do they concede a penalty? If Celtic concede a penalty, on average, it's around about half time. It's around about the 45th minute. Again, it's an average. But when the Rangers concede a penalty, well, it's not until about the 67th minute. That's a good 20 minutes later. Now, again, why does that matter? Because again, if football is a low-scoring sport, right? And if you get a goal up, and how many times have you been watching, Sky Sports, for example, and one team will score, and they'll immediately bring up the stat that says when Tottenham score first, they haven't lost for 2 years, or even that one with Motherwell. That one from when Motherwell scored first, even little Motherwell. When Motherwell scored first this season, they haven't lost, right? So a team scoring first is kind of important in a low-scoring sport. So clearly, the earlier you can get your goal in, the better, right? And so what we're seeing here is that the Rangers somehow are getting their penalties a lot earlier than Celtic, and not conceding till much later in the game. And again, why would that be? And is that is it statistically significant? Again, if we look at the differentials, so this is the average time difference between receiving and being awarded a penalty and conceding a penalty. You see that the Rangers, there's a 25-minute gap on average between when they receive a penalty and when they concede one. No other team comes close to that. Dundee United are a bit of an outlier at 15, but Celtic are at -10. They're right at the bottom of the table. Celtic, on average, get penalised 10 minutes earlier than what they receive a penalty. And again, this profile here, if you look at it statistically, is about 4 standard deviations from the mean. It's highly statistically significant. It's a real outlier. And why would that be? Why would one team, on average, get a penalty much earlier than the other? Now, penalties are quite rare. No laughing at the back, but even the Rangers only get 10 to 12 or 15 maybe a season. Celtic usually get less than 10. But this is over multiple. This is multi-year, trends. So there's clear patterns, I think, in the data here. So listen, we've talked a lot about penalties, and there's a good reason for that, which I'll come back to. But I just want to touch on as well, Paul. I want to touch on red cards, and again, this is the differential between red cards received and red cards that your opponents receive, positive or negative. And again, what we see is that once again, it's one club at the top. It's the Rangers who have a positive 12 cards that their opponents receive, versus more than what they've received over this time period, which again covers the period of Crawford Allen's being head of refereeing operations. So Rangers are about 3. If we look at it, break it down a little bit more. And look at the actual, bring it together. So this is really looking at red cards and penalties. So I'm trying to bring this together holistically. These red cards and penalties have big impacts on games. We know that. Going down to 10 players is a big impact, but penalties have an even more of an impact. So what this is showing us here is the total impact of red cards and penalties on Celtic and Rangers games going back to 2016-2017, which is when the new Rangers entity first got into the Premier League. And if you look at the early seasons, so 16-17 up to 19-20, Celtic were hugely dominant. You could see that the green columns, they're somewhere between 2 and 3 expected points that they benefit from red card and penalty decisions. Not a massive number, but you kind of expect that. It's a bit all over the place. There's no real trend there, I would say. Rangers are positive 2 years. One year they're more positive than Celtic. A couple of years they're a bit negative. But it all changes in the 2020-21 season. Again, what happened in 2021? Well, by coincidence, two things happened. One, Crawford Allen is appointed head of refereeing operations. But the second thing that happened is that the jeopardy and the jeopardy around winning the league increased massively. What do I mean by that? Well, in 2021, that's when 10 in a row was on the table, and that's a hugely psychologically significant landmark in Scottish football. And then the last two seasons that Postecoglou was here, both of those seasons were where the winner of the SPFL Premiership got direct entry into the Premier League. That hadn't happened for a number of seasons, and it happened in 21-22 and 22-23. Therefore, the prize was huge for winning the Scottish Premier League. Massively, you're guaranteed that Champions League pot. That Champions League pot, in the context of Scottish football, is enormous. It probably is no more than a Brighton and Hove Albion reserve player to an English club, but to a Scottish club, that extra 25, 30 million is absolutely game changing. And so the stakes were raised hugely in those seasons. And coincidentally, we started to see
You
the
keep using
emergence of a
that word,
pattern.
Alan. Coincidentally.
Coincidentally, we happened to see a pattern whereby the benefit to Rangers of red cards and penalties increased massively over those 3 seasons. Now, this season it's kind of neck and neck. I would characterise it that Celtic have had quite a few penalties this year. The Yorkshire Whistler hasn't identified any of them that were erroneous. Therefore, it's just really a natural consequence over a small sample size of Celtic being a dominant side. But Rangers' pattern is probably gone down a little bit. But generally, over those 4 seasons, when there's been huge amounts of either actual money at stake or bragging rights, huge psychological advantages at stake, we've suddenly seen the emergence of a distinct trend. So that's really key.
It's incredible to see this in the last slide, Alan, in relation to anyone who either has no skin in the game, or even if you do have your rose-tinted spectacles on, when you see it broken down like this, how can you argue? Really, how can you argue? I know you were saying previously when you started, throwing the truth bombs out on the podcast, some people might not want to hear it. That's part of the problem, Alan. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the facts. And then if we can have a balanced discussion about it, and in the knowledge that every single one of us has inherent bias, because you and I are Celtic supporters, we get it. If that was flipped the other way around and we thought we had an argument, this would tell us we didn't have an argument. So I think that in doing it in such a way whereby you've got the data in place, you're talking us through it step by step. This one here is sensational to see the upturn, as you say, going for the 10 in the first season, where you see the absolute jump and the spike, and then it's continued through the Champions League money, and really, even though Celtic have come up this season, the Rangers, the Rangers tally is still huge. It's still high, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and listen, this is big. These are big moments, and I'll come to. So I want to talk a little bit as we wrap up, really, about the difference between sort of red cards and penalties. My penalties, in particular, are important, but I want to just kind of one final data point. So we've talked about really all of the crucial elements of refereeing. We've talked about penalties. We've talked about red cards. The Yorkshire Whistler also looks at goals that are allowed and disallowed, any contentiousness in that sense as well. I should have mentioned that. Let's look at the simple foul. Now, again, I would come at this that a foul doesn't lead to sometimes it can lead to a shot to goal. It has a nuisance value. It breaks up attacks and all that sort of thing. But in general terms, a simple foul, I wouldn't expect there to be really any kind of trends in the data around this. But guess what? If we look at fouls, what you're showing here is now. It says at the top there, possession adjusted. This isn't some Celtic jiggery pokery. This is possession adjustment is a very common tool used in football analysis, which would allow you to, for example, to compare Manchester City against, let's say, Sheffield United, or would allow you to compare Celtic against St Mirren, because if a St Mirren defender, for example, makes an awful lot more defensive tackles, let's say, than a Celtic defender, right? So the way that you make sure that you're comparing apples with apples is you possession adjust the data, and you possession adjust it in a way that reduces the Celtic, increases the Celtic number, reduces the St Mirren number, as if both teams had 50% possession. So if both teams had 50% possession, what would the numbers look like? And because Celtic and Rangers are so dominant, Celtic average 68% possession over the years that the Rangers have been in the SPFL Premiership, and the Rangers average about 62% possession. That's clearly dominant teams, right? So you have to possession judge it, otherwise you're not. And there's a 6% difference every season between even Celtic and the Rangers. So you have to possession adjust it to compare apples with apples. So that's what possession adjustment is. And another thing I would say is there seems to be a weird thing, which I'm not totally sure, I've not seen any research on, is that possession dominant teams seem to give away more fouls on that basis. And I think it's to do with the fact that they probably press more, they probably press higher and more aggressively, whereas teams who are lacking possession probably sit in a bit. So on average, Celtic will concede more fouls than St Mirren on this basis, because and Rangers do as well. So both clubs tend to, on an average basis, on a possession adjusted basis, concede more fouls. That's why you see that the two columns there, the blue one and the green one, are slightly higher. So what is this showing you? This is showing you the possession adjusted fouls in the Premier League for Celtic and Rangers in terms of fouls awarded and fouls conceded. And again, remarkably, on that basis, the Rangers opponents are penalised 27% more than Celtics, right? So that doesn't now, if you're a Celtic fan, that doesn't impact you. You're not watching that game, But what's happening as Celtic are playing, their game, is that Rangers opponents are being treated more harshly than Celtic's opponents are, and by 27%. And also Celtic themselves are being penalised around 9% more than the Rangers. So Rangers, Celtic on a possession adjusted basis give up about 18, just over 18 fouls a game. With the Rangers, it's just about 16 and a half. It's about a 9% difference. But the real kind of differentiator, even in the simple foul, is the fact that the referees seem to penalise Rangers opponents far more harshly than they do Celtic's opponents, and by a considerable percentage.
What I find
So,
interesting about this one, Alan, after a game where you've dominated and you see the possession, and as you say, Celtic, did you say it was 68% normally, the average is in a domestic game? And you ask yourself, how can we possibly give away so many fouls? So I'm glad you cleared that up, because that's a question I ask all the time. And it's a case of you've got that high press whereby when you lose the ball, you're very, very keen to get it back. And obviously you're being a bit reckless and you're giving away fouls. But from that particular slide, I think the most incredible thing, it shouldn't be a surprising thing, is the fact that you could have two sets of opponents doing exactly the same thing, yet they're being penalised in one game more, to the tune of 27% than when they're playing Celtic. And now it gets to the point, though, Alan, we've heard all the arguments, we've heard the terminology in terms of what's an anomaly, this, that, and the other, and we always hear the cliches. And I think that when it comes to punditry, we've heard some things that just doesn't stack up. It doesn't stack up at all when you're talking about these differentials and the gaps between what Celtic are awarded or otherwise against what Rangers are. Because when you look through these stats and the series of slides that you've prepared, it inevitably comes down to that. You spoke about the two-team dominated football landscape. If you go back to the year dot when the league started, on one occasion in all that time, has a team called Celtic or Rangers not won the league three years in succession? Only once has that happened in the early 80s with Dundee United and Aberdeen. Have Celtic or Rangers not won the league for 3 years? It's happened once. Where else in world football is that level of domination so prevalent? So you're right in expecting a lot of these figures to be similar. because we're spending the same length of time in the opposition's half in attacking positions in their box. And you would expect then for everything to be more or less level. But when you're bringing up these graphs and these tables, and it's showing, Alan, the outlier, and time again, that outlier is Rangers. So I guess as a football fan, I'm going to ask you why that is. Why is that? Because we get called paranoid, we get called, moon howlers, ambulance chase, all these different things just for pointing it out, Alan. And this is for me, it's a culture within Scottish football. Other Celtic fans moaning about refs again. But when you actually see the data, you think, well, we do have an argument. We absolutely do. So what do you think the main reasons behind this are? Because we talk about culture all the time, don't we? We talk about bias. What, in your view, creates these figures and this data that you've presented today?
Yeah, so I suppose, listen, what am I not? I'm not a social historian. I'm not a behavioral psychologist. I'm not, these are questions I think that people with that skill set would be best placed to answer fully. I can give you my opinion. You mentioned culture. I think that's a very big term, and one that can probably be misunderstood. But what I'm really hoping to do here is to really emphasize that and answer the question: do we have a problem? And I think, we've looked at simple counts. We've counted red cards. We've counted penalties. We've had an independent expert assessment of all of the big calls in all the games over a multiple year period. We've looked at the probabilities or the likelihoods of getting penalties based on statistically sound proxies for attacking. We've looked at the trends in terms of the impacts of, what impact did that penalty have? What impact did that suddenly have based on the score, based on the time that was awarded? We've looked at trends even in simple fouls. As a data person and not as an organizational psychologist or what have you, all I can say is, to me, if one of those data points, had been highly statistically significant, I would have gone, okay, that's interesting and might be worth looking at. But, given the nature of Scottish football, that could happen. I could see that could happen. But what you're seeing across all of the data points is the same pattern, and it's the pattern of assistance for one club.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that make sense? And I don't think it does. It doesn't make sense to me. If we were talking about, let's say, Paris Saint-Germain, they win 9 French titles in a row. They absolutely batter when they had Messi and Mbappe and all that. They're battering every team every week. They're winning the league by 30 points, 9 seasons or whatever it is. I would sort of, and you showed me this pattern. I'd think, well, it's not good, but I could probably kind of get behind it. That would be plausible. Bayern Munich in Germany, look at the Croatian champions, or CSK Sofia in Bulgaria. There's lots of examples of highly dominant teams. We're talking about the second best team in Scotland.
Yeah.
Celtic have won 12 out of the last 13 titles, and yet, the highly significant outlier and the pattern of assistance is to one team. And it's the nature of it. And that's where the nature of it, the nature of the patterns is kind of what makes me suspicious as well. And what do I mean by that? If I was minded, if I refereed myself, if I was minded to subvert a game, my tool to do that would be a penalty, because it has the most impact on a game. A penalty gives you depending on which website you follow, which XG model you use. Let's take the higher one. A penalty gives you a 79% chance of scoring a goal, right? So if you want to influence a game, give a team a penalty, give them as early as you can. Right?
Yeah.
That's how you can influence. That's how you're going to influence the game. If you want the stats to look good, give a team a penalty when they're 5-0 up in the 90th minute. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying, and I'm not suggesting it is explicit as that, but the patterns in the data, that's what they're telling us. The trend with one particular club is a lack of jeopardy. It's a lack of jeopardy. It's very easy to measure things that happen. So, for example, if you had a team that's continually getting soft penalties, even the Scottish media would suddenly kind of start to question that, right? But if it's the absence of something, not getting a penalty, not getting a player sent off, those are much harder. You know, you look at the BBC report after a game, Connor Goldson's done something weird again. Oh, and Motherwell might have felt that Goldson got away with one, and that's it. That's all you get.
Yeah.
That is literally the start and end of the scrutiny. But if you give a penalty, that gets looked at. The pundits look at it, all that sort of thing. So it's the absence of, and this is the trend. It's the not getting penalties at the other end. Isn't even the award? Even though Tav Penn has probably taken more penalties than any other footballer in history of the world, nearly. Apart from Cristiano Ronaldo, probably. I think he is literally getting near the top 10 in world football. These are noticeable events, but not giving a penalty, you know, not it's giving the opposition, a lot of fouls against them. These things are kind of minor, but they all add up, and the trends are there. Listen, football is a low scoring sport, as I said before. Rangers and Celtic, I think Celtic have lost twice in 136 games when scoring first. Rangers have lost once in 134 games when scoring first. If they get a lead, right, you've pretty much guaranteed the 3 points. And look at the trends in terms of when times of penalties and average are awarded. And the reason I say penalties are so powerful is two things. Think back to the Hearts game. Yang got sent off very early in the game. It was about the 16th minute or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for the next more or less 40 minutes, 30 minutes, Celtic were comfortable. The Hearts crowd were getting restless. They didn't know how to break down Celtic. Celtic were in their shape. They had the better players. I was watching that game thinking I'm pretty confident we can nick a goal here. But the penalty near half time, the penalty completely changed it, because then Celtic have to chase the game. They're a goal down, and that completely became a bridge too far, a man down and a penalty. There was two interesting bits of research that I found. One by the Athletic, which I think one of the top selling sports journals, and an analysis website called Sabermetric Research, and they have both published papers stating that penalties in football are they're far too harsh a penalty for the award for the fouls that are given. What do I mean by that is, so you think about the Scottish context. A lot of penalties are awarded when long balls or crosses or corners get lumped into the box and the ball's bouncing around and it hits somebody on the arm. That's a really common scenario, right? So if I cross the ball into you, Paul, and you go for a header in the box from a corner, right? Because of the number of defenders in the box and the organisation of the defence, the average expected goals from a header from a corner, even if you head the ball from, let's say, it's central to the goal, further forward than the penalty spot, not quite in the 6-yard box, decent position, you get your head on it, you've got around about a 5% chance of scoring, right? If your header hits somebody in the arm and the referee gives a penalty, that 5%, that foul that prevented a 5% chance of scoring becomes a 79% chance of scoring.
79%.
So penalties are disproportionately penal, really, in football. It's a fundamental flaw in football. Think about a player running away from the box on the touchline that gets a clip from behind, falls over. If the player, who by the way is running away from goal, if the player had been shooting from that position wide on the penalty area, again, you're looking at a 6% shot at best by an XG model, probably less. And yet, you clip their heels and you get your reward for that is a 79% chance. So penalty, that's what. So I come back to full circle. Although I wasn't particularly excited by the penalty count, penalties are crucial in terms of, if you were to subvert a game of football, how would you do it? And across all these data points, there's a clear refereeing problem here, because there are clear patterns of assistance for one club. And what I must emphasize is this is not an old firm issue. This isn't a big club issue. Otherwise, Celtic would be at the same extreme end of highly statistically significant numbers as Rangers. In fact, more so, because they've won 12 out of the last 13 titles, but they're not. So this isn't a big club issue. It's an SFA issue, whereby their referees, for whatever reason, and I think culture has a lot to do with it, seem to benefit one club. Because remember, we talk about, you hear the press use the word incompetence. If it was incompetence, there would be no pattern. If somebody is just bad at their job or gives a poor decision, and historically does so, they're all human, they will do eventually. It wouldn't have a pattern to it.
No.
It would randomly appear, those errors, over a multi-year period. But as we've seen, they don't. There are patterns. There are clear patterns. And if it was one or two data points, if it was just counting penalties, I would say, okay, it's interesting, and we can have a bit of banter about Masons and all this bollocks, but it isn't. It's multiple data points over multiple years of data, and therefore, and it's the second best team in Scotland.
Mhm.
So Scottish football has a problem. The problem is at Hampden, and specifically the behaviour and the culture of the Scottish Football Association. And this isn't new if you're a Celtic fan. The public data is overwhelming in terms of the SFA's behaviour and attitude towards Celtic. We don't have to go over all the recent examples, but there's plenty of them. So everybody in Scottish football should be concerned about, because it impacts all of them, and they should be driving change, and they should be, I know what's going to happen, but when this pod goes out, right, you're going to get a cultural reflex. You're going to get people dicing and slicing data, coming up with small samples to prove that Celtic get lots of penalties too, and all those bollocks. You've got to have a robust methodology. You've got to be consistent about your timelines. But that reflex, that cultural reflex I'm talking about, speaks to the problem that we have in Scotland. I think about, how can we deal this? How can we deal with this? One set of fans also who, whenever they get a throw in wrongly awarded against them, break into a rendition of F the SFA, will be piling in on the back of this podcast to
Yeah,
defend the SFA. But what they don't realise is it impacts them too. This is
it
about holding
does.
the SFA to account.
Yeah,
That's the key
and
issue.
you've shown that. You've shown that it's a pattern that doesn't benefit Celtic. It does benefit one team to the detriment of all others. And I think the big thing for me, whenever I look at situations, let's say with Celtic, and I'm talking about it on a Celtic State of Mind, Alan, I'll always look for, right, how to make it better. How can we fix it? Where do we go from here? Because, that's quite bleak, what we've just discussed there for the best part of an hour, in that we've got an association that marks its own homework. Everything's fine. 99.7% of our decisions are okay. Absolutely. When it can be proven that that's not the case. And you think, well, Crawford Allen is stepping down, but if it is a cultural issue, someone else will step into the culture and it will continue as it has done before. And that's why that's such a scary and bleak outlook. What can be done in terms of Scottish football? How can it be fixed? Is there any kind of light on the horizon here as a Scottish football fan, Alan, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the SFA have traditionally been resistant to any changes at all. Really, that is a major part of the problem. But in terms of, you're absolutely spot on. We can sit here and complain and point out the data and so forth. But what do we want to see done about it? So I would encourage people to go to the Sentinel Celts website, and there's an article on there. And just let me get the name of the article: Resolution on Refereeing Standards, and it's a proposal for how refereeing could be better organised in Scotland. That I think, organisationally would at least start to address some of these problems. And the key concept is really thinking about refereeing as a service, because it very much feels to me in Scottish football that the SFA see themselves as masters of the game, and we're all lucky to be here and lucky that they give us the time of day and put on a football match for us. Now, that makes sense to me in terms of things like setting standards for safeguarding of, you know, grassroots football, of things like, organising, youth football and all that sort of thing, and even in terms of a lot of the refereeing capabilities. But where I think we need to perhaps look to England a little bit as an example is I would actually split out refereeing and actually split responsibilities between the Football Association and the league, or even have an independent body, professional body of referees that that essentially are service providers to the league, and you know, those of listeners that have worked in business, this is a pretty standard, you know, client provider relationship, and the league should absolutely, the SFA, sorry, should absolutely be accountable for recruiting and training officials, because the SFA are the body who oversee any rule changes in the game. So they are the door into the Scottish game for rule changes that impact all levels of the game in Scotland. So they should absolutely ensure that referees are trained and accredited to UEFA, FIFA standards. That should be their role, and they should have a clear, auditable trail of that accreditation and so forth. That's fine. But then once they've appointed officials to individual games, then the league, which is essentially the customer, the league should be responsible for evaluating and monitoring the performance against an agreed set of standards and an agreed set of behaviours and so forth, and outcomes and trends and so forth that they would expect to see from refereeing, and therefore, and you know, if you think about it, it's like any sort of customer-client relationship. If you're not happy with the service you're getting, then in theory you could perhaps go elsewhere and get your refereeing services from another provider. But that would be a start to at least put it on a professional footing, put it on a client-customer footing, and all of the oversight, the separation of duties, the separation of responsibilities that would entail. I think that would be a start. Now, would you still get the same SFA culture? Would you still get the same individuals who came through that route and are subject to the same peer pressures and the same cultural influences? Yes, you probably would. But at least if the league as a professional body was the ones responsible for monitoring and evaluating, they would be doing so to a higher standard. They would be doing so to an agreed set of objectives, an agreed set of outcomes that could be measured in a way that avoid, or at least make sure that what the outcomes that I've presented here, that they are not happening, etc., and that a fair standard is being achieved for all, and that the SFA aren't marking their own homework anymore, and all of that. So that to me, so if you go to the Sentinel Celts website, I think, Paul, you're going to put a link to that article in
Yeah.
under the YouTube in the comments, etc. I recommend you get behind it. They're asking for small shareholders to sign up to this idea as a resolution to be put to the AGM. I think, listen, let's not sit here and complain about it. Let's do something about it. That at least would then start. But listen, supporters of other clubs as well, you need to get behind something similar with your own teams, because it looks like, you know, you're suffering from this as well.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, we had to get over that hump of the way that we are viewed as Celtic supporters, Alan, in terms of, you know, always complaining. How on earth did you win 12 out of 13 titles if everyone's against you? That's something you hear all the time. And then even if you were to give me a number of penalty kicks and they were exactly the same between Celtic and Rangers, conceded or awarded, the key for me, and the key takeaway for me on this one, is the impact of those penalties. When are they awarded? You know, and this is massive. This is huge. So it's not just about, as you say, having a tally of red cards or penalty kicks. It's about the actual impact that they have on the team being awarded or otherwise. So thank you for the work you've put into that, Alan. This was not scripted, and I promised Alan that I would go in studs up if I seen anything that I thought I disagreed with. But to be fair, I'm looking at it and it's been well enough put together, Alan, that it's very difficult to argue with. And that's what I like about data and building a dossier of information. I'm going to go back to some of the things you said, the quotes that were used at the very offset when we were looking at the data and some of the reactions that had. And you said that Graeme Spears called it bizarre. There was a quote, "How can it be explained?" Exactly. I think you've explained what the data is, Alan. How can that be explained as the next part? And beating himself an anomaly that cannot be explained. Well, it can, and we need to push for that change. And I think that the article that you referred to, the Sentinel Celts, if you go and have a read at that, and if possible, get behind it. The link is underneath this video. Let us know in the comments section, what do you think about these findings, the data that were presented today or has been presented by Alan? Let us know in the comments section. Get in touch on the social media channels as well. I've got to thank you for coming here, Alan, because obviously, as you said, it wasn't commercially viable for the mainstream to cover such a topic. We are only too happy to cover it on Acsom. I think it's an important subject, and I knew that when you were coming to the table, it would be explained in such a way that it's hard to argue with, because there it is in black and white. So thank you so much for all the work that you put into it. It's quite clear that you've spent a lot of time pulling that together, Alan. Thank you so much for that. Join us again as normal at 12:30 every weekday on A Celtic State of Mind. Let us know your thoughts on this in the comments section on the social media channel. And all that's left for me to say, Alan Morrison, thank you again for joining me on A Celtic State of Mind.
Thanks, Paul.